Hi, I'm Gary Hirshberg from Stonyfield Yogurt. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you physically today, and I appreciate the organizers allowing me to be with you by video. I've been in the organic yogurt business for 28 years. Back when I started, of course, it was a pretty crazy idea. I often tell people that I had a wonderful company, a great idea. The only problem was there was no supply and no demand. Today, of course, organics is a big business. It's about $30 billion industry. My own company is about $400 million. And we've been growing at a compounded growth rate of healthy double digits now for something like 24 years. Now, people often say that organic is not proven. It's a clever idea, but it's really hasn't proven itself. And here's the unexpected truth that I want to share with you today. It's actually the chemicals that are not proven. We've been on an experiment with our bodies and the planet for some 60 or 70 years. Literally, if you think about it, all food was organic before World War II. All food. Every famous person in history ate only organic food. We've been experimenting with our bodies and our planets, and I'm here to share with you some unexpectedly bad news, but also some very good news about what we can do about it. And I want to focus my few minutes with you today on this very topic, the topic of agricultural sustainability, to examine and expose some myths about the productivity of some conventional ag practices and to share some surprisingly positive findings about organic food production. In the big picture, my view is that we've evolved down a flawed path in terms of our relationship to nature and our planet, based not just on faulty assumptions, but outright myths that go to the heart about how we govern ourselves and manage our economies. The myth, for example, that waste is an acceptable byproduct of our economic activities. No other species generates waste. Their waste is always the food for something else. The myth that there's a place called away where we send our waste. The myth that our earth is infinitely resilient to handle our abuses, to take whatever we dish out and whatever we dump on her. The myth that the earth is actually a subsidiary of our economies. Really, it's the reciprocal that's true. All of our economies have been made possible by a bountiful earth. So we've just got it exactly wrong. And finally, the myth of externalities, this idea that we can have direct economic consequences direct consequences of our economic behavior that can have serious implications, like a national obesity epidemic or a national diabetes epidemic or climate change or depletion of fossil waters or hypoxias in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these are direct consequences of how we behave as economic beings, but they don't appear in our income statements or our balance sheets, and therefore nobody's accountable. That's a myth. We can't have direct consequences of our behaviors for which we're not held accountable. Otherwise, we're literally leaving our children with a planet far worse than anything we've ever inherited. Now, these myths show up in every aspect of our relationship to nature, but especially in our agriculture. To be sure, thanks to the Green Revolution, the world added just 10% to farmland, but more than doubled food production in the 20th century. This saved, of course, millions of lives and allowed for booming growth and economic development, but it came with a price. The price was environmental consequences that are becoming more evident and more pressing. And of course, these consequences are in fact health consequences as well. Essentially, we've benefited from cheap or free ecological services that will not be free in the future. For instance, as we deplete fossil water reserves underlying the Midwestern U.S., the Oklahoma Panhandle and the Ogallala Aquifer, and as climate change eliminates glaciers, water is going to become known as the oil of the 21st century. Worldwide water usage has actually doubled every 21 years, largely due to unsustainable irrigation and soil management practices. Our food system, while enormously successful at producing large volumes, is actually over-dependent on fossil fuels. Our current food system consumes 7.3 units of fossil energy for every unit of food energy that we produce. Our food system creates concentrated waste that pose health and environmental risks. It's weakening, if not destroying, ecosystems such as fisheries. We have these hypoxias that I mentioned earlier, not just in the Gulf of Mexico, but in every major estuary in the country and in the world. These are zones that are completely absent of dissolved oxygen. And since 1960, the number has doubled each decade. And the major culprit is agricultural runoff. We've had incredible topsoil depletion. 50% of the topsoils that were here when Lewis and Clark crossed the country are now gone. Then these patterns, of course, have put more marginal land into production and increased the use of chemicals, fossil fuels, and water. Annual fertilizer use has actually increased tenfold since 1960. There have been devastating reductions in biodiversity as a result of our agriculture system. It's estimated that we're losing one species every 20 minutes. But fundamentally, the biggest flaw of our food system, our modern food system, is that it's not actually meeting the nutritional needs of 1 to 2 billion people. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, 925 million people tonight currently suffer from hunger and malnutrition. They go to sleep hungry. And estimates say that a further billion are undernourished, suffering from a so-called silent hunger. Undernourished children grow more slowly, their mental development is often delayed, and they are more susceptible to diseases. These are direct consequences of our modern food system. And finally, of course, the most penetrating and I think pervasive problem of our food system is it's actually making us sick. We do have this obesity epidemic. Actually, 2/3 of Americans are obese or overweight. A fifth grader today weighs 10 pounds more than in the 1960s when I was growing up here in Manchester. 1 in 3 children born after 2000 are going to be a type 2 diabetic. And actually, our obesity crisis is costing Americans $150 billion to treat the number one health threat of our times. Now, this situation, bad as it may be, and you're probably wondering why they invited such a depressing guy to come talk to you, I will get to the good news soon. This situation is further complicated and compounded when you focus on toxins. We've been profoundly reckless with toxic chemicals during a 70-year spree, especially in our food system, and yet today we're exposed to between 80 and 100,000 chemicals a day, human-made compounds every single day. And nobody has seriously looked at the synergistic impacts of how they interact, since there's some 3 billion potential combinations. Only a fraction have ever been tested for toxicity in adults, let alone in children. And yet the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, estimates that you and I are walking around with an average of about 148 chemicals in our bodies. The President's Cancer Panel last year concluded that 41% of Americans now alive will be diagnosed with some form of cancer. That's nearly 1 in 2 of us, half of us. And we all know, and we know now that the percentages are even higher among farm workers and their families. And this esteemed panel found that the number one cause of this epidemic of cancer is the daily exposure to hazardous chemicals in our air, our water, our soils, but notably in our foods. In recent years, we've seen data linking pesticide exposures to autoimmune diseases, autism, ADHD exposures, diagnoses. Research published just a couple months ago indicated that prenatal pesticide exposure actually lowers the IQ in children by ages 9. And now, despite 30 years of progress in the organic movement, my business, we face probably the greatest threat yet, the fruition of several decades of seeding and investing by the world's largest chemical companies to create a sense of urgency and even inevitability on the part of our policymakers in favor of deregulating genetically engineered seeds and crops. The only problem is that 13 years after introducing genetically engineered corn, soy, cotton, and other crops into the American food system, not only have they failed to deliver the promise of higher intrinsic yields, but farmers using these crops have actually increased herbicide use by almost 400 million pounds. That's a 10-fold increase in the reliance by modern agriculture on systemic toxins. And we're seeing an explosion, even worse, of superweeds. These are, as we use herbicide-tolerant crops and farmers put more herbicides down, the weeds are not waiting around to do focus groups. They're evolving very quickly to become herbicide-tolerant themselves. And as we do that, farmers are now being forced to use defoliants like we used in Vietnam, Agent Orange, 2,4-D, which are truly and obviously known as carcinogens. And these stronger chemicals are now increasing in dramatic proportions. Now these crops, these genetically engineered crops, spread by pollution, and now 90% of spread by pollination, genetic pollution, if you will. And now 90% of U.S. soy, corn, and cotton are actually contaminated. And this has resulted in an explosion of chemical use needed to support these crops. Here's one example, herbicide-tolerant alfalfa. Alfalfa is used primarily for hay. Not only did herbicide-tolerant alfalfa, genetically engineered, not solve a problem it solved a problem that didn't exist. Only 7% of alfalfa in this country was using herbicides, but now potentially could cause irreversible damage to one of the fastest growing economic sectors of our country, namely the organic sector, which now accounts for 4% of U.S. food. Now, of course, the organic sector relies heavily on hay for feed. And yet now we've got genetically engineered hay out there, which requires herbicides, which means that if you find it in your food system, then you can't call your food organic anymore. Now Monsanto and other biotech advocates say, hey, nothing to worry about. Herbicides don't hurt people. But these claims are obviously suspect due to the sources that they come from. And by the way, the same companies who are telling us this stuff own the patents and the seeds. Monsanto's CEO recently announced that half their profit growth this year will come from such seeds. So they've whipped us up and our policymakers up into a frenzy that genetic engineering is the only hope for the future. The only problem, again, is that these crops have really had a failure to yield, to deliver on their yields. Drought-resistant corn, genetically engineered drought-resistant corn, which we're hearing about on the news now, may seem like a good idea, but early studies on these varieties developed so far have shown that the gene that confers drought resistance also makes the corn more susceptible to disease, which means you need more toxins, you need more herbicides, you need more pesticides. Traditional breeding practices, on the other hand, create varieties that are adapted to the system in which they're grown and therefore are much better at helping us breed plants that are able to thrive in their environment without the assistance of massive amounts of herbicides and pesticides. Now, the ultimate vision here is, of course, food security for all. I'm sure we can all agree to that vision. A world where people have access to healthy, safe, nutritious food that's produced in a way that not only doesn't destroy, but in fact restores the planet's ecosystems that are obviously right now under enormous stress. True agricultural sustainability can only be achieved through a systems approach that simultaneously addresses productivity, ecology, farm worker, societal health, and nutrition. An ag system that is extremely productive but does nothing to address environmental impacts or the obesity problem is not a sustainable one. Nor is a system that has minimal impact on the environment but is low yielding and doesn't produce enough food. In order to be successful, a sustainable system, a sustainable economy, must also be adaptive and resilient to changing conditions, especially in the face of climate change. It turns out, here's the unexpected, organic agriculture is the most advanced and sophisticated system we have for farming today that efficiently balances the goals of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. Essentially, in the history of agriculture, it's always been about taking away topsoils, taking away water, taking away habitat, taking away the rights of farmers to safe and healthy environments, taking away the rights of consumers to safe and healthy foods, taking away the rights of farmers to good incomes, and of course, taking away the rights of future generations, the yet to be born, to a sustainable and healthy world. But with organic, everything and everybody wins. Today at Stonyfield, we support 1,600 family farmers through a cooperative called the Organic Valley Cooperative. We actually bought our 1 billionth pound of organic milk this year. And here's what our milk purchases alone have done in terms of this win-win approach. This year, they've supported over 180,000 acres of chemical-free farmland. We've avoided this year, our milk purchases alone, over 9 million pounds of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, over 425,000 drug treatments. We don't use antibiotics prophylactically, so we save antibiotics for when they're really needed instead of creating resistance among bugs out there. We've avoided, obviously, thousands and thousands of drug treatments of synthetic growth hormone. We've avoided over 185,000 pounds of insecticides and herbicides. In terms of win-win, our farmers earn 60 to 100% more income. Their animals live longer. They literally live twice as long. Organic cows have double the lactations. So farmers are making more money. The cows are more productive over their lifetime with far less inputs. On milk, we know now that organic farms raising Holsteins require about the same amount of land to sustain a milk cow as non-organic, but significantly less prime cropland compared to high production farms, which feed large quantities of corn and soy. What that means is we can use the large amounts of high quality productive farmland to feed the world, to feed the 2 billion who are not properly being fed, to grow cereals and grains, and we can grow dairy cows and sheep and other animals on marginal land, again, where they're mostly grass-based. Grass-based means higher omega-3s. Omega-3s are necessary as an anti-inflammatory basis to help avoid disease and problems, also even to avoid cancers. Cancer is basically an inflammatory disease. When you have high omega-3s, you have a high anti-inflammatory component to your food. That comes from eating fresh food. That comes from animals eating grass. The milk from organic cows is much, much higher in omega-3s and much lower in omega-6s. Our organic sugar, for example, is grown on 40,000 acres in Brazil. There we've had a 90% reduction in pest damage. We've increased biodiversity, bringing back 312 species that weren't there when the land was not grown organically. We've improved groundwater quality and volume. We've improved the topsoil carbon content. It's now almost equal to the native forests that were there when the colonists came down and took the trees down. Literally, the carbon content, we've now fixed carbon from the atmosphere into the topsoil. But here's the punchline. We've had a 10% increase in yields and a 50% reduction in the cost premium of organic. Organic sugar used to cost me 100% more. Today, it actually costs less than conventional. Why? Because organic does not depend on inflating fossil fuels, does not depend on inflating chemical fertilizers, which come from natural gas. According to the United Nations, the use of organic practices can increase yields in developing countries in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia by anywhere from 86 to 113%, nearly essentially doubling yields. At the same time, they found that these same practices allow farmers to decrease pesticide use by 85% or more. An analysis of 114 projects in 24 African countries found that yields had more than doubled where organic or near organic practices were being used. We've seen this time and again with milk studies, crop studies, corn studies. Organic yields actually over time, not necessarily in the first couple of years, but over time become equal to or better than conventional practices. Now, look, genetic engineering may someday lead to the development of crops that can help improve the sustainability of agriculture, but we have actually yet to see this. Currently available GE crops have not increased intrinsic yields, but have substantially increased pesticide use. Now, I want to bring this to a close as I end my time with you and look at this back in the big picture. You know, I set out 28 years ago to create an organic food company that could prove that it's profitable to be that it's possible to be profitable growing organic, healthy foods. It's possible for everybody to win, the animals to win, our ecosystems to win, farmers to win, and so forth. And really, that's probably our key contribution. If there's a key contribution that Stonyfield and the other early generation organic companies have accomplished, it's this. What I now understand is that we've created a modest but provocative economic model that it doesn't have to be all about taking, stripping away future generations' rights. Indeed, we've proven that all stakeholders can win. Our farmers, our employees, our shareholders, our consumers, our retailers, our distributors, livestock, the planet, all have accrued economic and ecologic wins. And so too have our children as we built topsoils, created a basis for farmers' kids to take over the family farm or start their own. My little $25, $26 billion industry is now 4% of total U.S. food, but rapidly heading to double digits. And so now this all comes back to you. You know, we in New Hampshire and we across our country obsess about elections. They never seem to end here in New Hampshire, and we obviously get a chance to vote and exercise our free will once every 2 or 4 years. But if you stop and think about it, we exercise our votes every single day with how we shop. Now, you've just heard my rap. You know, believe me, when an item runs over a scanner in a supermarket, you're voting, and corporate America spends billions of dollars to tally those votes. So I ask you, do you want to vote for a system that increases pesticide and herbicide and toxins use, that depletes our ecosystems, that makes our country and our nation more dependent on fossil fuels? And by the way, think about this. When almost 1 in 2 of us are getting cancer, imagine the health costs. Imagine the bankrupting that this will do to the American economy. We not only are bankrupting ourselves by sending our money abroad to bring in oil and fossil fuels that we do not need as we could build healthy organic soils, but we're also, in our focus on sickness care, not on preventative health care, we are literally bankrupting ourselves. So the choice is yours. What kind of system do you want to have? We vote every day. You can vote every day. You can go out tomorrow. You don't have to change everything you buy. Buy a yogurt, buy a wine, buy a beer, buy a sandwich, buy something organic, and believe me, the corporate world will tally your vote and start to invest more in the kind of world we want. You know, Gandhi said it best. He said, anyone who thinks they're too small to make a difference has never been in bed with a mosquito. We all need to be mosquitoes, buzzing away, biting away, changing the world for the better. Thanks so much for listening.